So hello everyone, thank you for logging in. Let's give a minute or two to allow others to log in. Thank you for logging in on time. Welcome everyone. As we wait for others, you could probably type in which country you're listening from, or town if you're in Kenya. As we wait for others, I see a few people are logging in. Let's give them a second or two. Scotland, Kenya, South Africa, wow, USA. Oh, thank you guys for logging in. It's good to see each one of you. I'll say good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome very much to this webinar today. We are discussing about relationship between trauma and addiction. As I introduce our speaker, I would request that we can stop writing about where you are, or you can still do that. But what are your expectations today? Kindly type in on the question box and let our presenter get to know what your expectation is today. So once again, welcome. We have a mixed audience from Kenya. This presentation is being done from Kenya. We are presenters from Kenya, being hosted by ISSUP Global, but we are members of ISSUP Kenya chapter. So you're very welcome once again. I would like to introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Catherine Muthiani. Many of you know her as Kate, those who are Kenyans, and our international guest, she's called Catherine Muthiani. She's a counseling psychologist and ICAP 3, which is a credentialing for practitioners in addiction. She has over 11 years of training and counseling experience, and is currently the head of training in SAPTA, which is an organization in Kenya that provides various levels of training for addiction counselors. Kate has special interest in women and addiction and trauma. So she's the right person to speak to us today. She also has very strong bonds with Mukuru Promotion Center in Nairobi, Kenya, where she mentors young children who are in that community, especially girls. So I would like to invite you all to this webinar. The webinar is being recorded, so it will be available on the ISSUP.net website. You'll also receive certificates at the end of the webinar. Maybe in about 24 hours, the certificates will be ready for you. Once again, remember to type your questions in the question box. I would like to look through the expectations as I allow Catherine to set up her presentation. So evidence of relationship between trauma and addiction. One is saying that they would want to understand how trauma impacts upon addiction, and how I'll finish that question when I can. Then somebody from South Africa is happy to be part of this. Catherine, can you see any other question? Any other?
I'm sorry, Susan, I'm not able to see the questions.
Okay, so I hope you at least have an idea of the expectations. There's somebody from India. Somebody says, I would like to understand the behavioral progression and link between trauma to addiction. Okay, so we have 6 minutes into the webinar, so I would allow Catherine or Kate for most people to take it over. Karibu sana, Catherine. That's welcome in Kenya.
Thank you so much, Susan, for the wonderful welcoming remarks and introduction. You've made me take a seat back and wonder whether that was me that was being introduced. So hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are joining from around the globe. So today I'm excited to be with you this evening as we unpack the relationship between trauma and addiction. I like the expectations that have been given, and I hope my presentation will be able to give that and more. So by the end of it, this is what I'm hoping to achieve, that we'll be able to have a meaningful definition of trauma and addiction. Then also for us to be able to appreciate that complex relationship between the two. My presentation will be more focusing on adverse childhood experiences, that is those traumatic experiences that happen to people in their first 18 years of their lives, and how that can relate with substance use disorder. And then how that can be transformed into practice by helping us to see the need to adopt trauma-informed approaches when we are working with people with substance use disorder. So just getting right away and looking at a definition of addiction. This is adopted from ISSUP, that addiction as we know it is treatable, it's chronic, and it's a medical disease with some complex interactions among brain circuits. So there is a way in which addiction affects how messages in the brain are communicated. There is some genetic predisposition to it, but we cannot also blame on the brain circuits and genes alone, but also the instrumental role that environment plays in influencing addiction, together with person's experience. It said if you don't use it, even when you have genetic predisposition, or if you don't engage in an addictive behavior, you don't get addicted. So there's something that is quite unique with addiction, that as people use substances or engage in behaviors that are addictive, it becomes quite compulsive in such a way that even though there are harmful consequences that are staring at the person still uses. So there is compulsivity that develops when somebody develops addiction. And we shall also see whether there is similarities in compulsivity with someone that has gone through traumatic experiences. Another way of looking at addiction, if we adopt the DSM-5, particularly looking at addiction to substances, that condition that people developed out of being dependent on substances, known as substance use disorder. There are 11 criteria that are there to define substance use disorder, but just collapsing them into 4 criteria. That someone that has substance use disorder, which is characteristic of continued use of substances that is problematic despite the negative consequences that somebody continues to get. This could be health, this could be problems at work, this would be problems in relationship. So one of impaired control. Somebody wants to stop using, but they can't. Somebody spends so much time that they intend to use the substances. Somebody also takes much more than they had previously intended. So that impairs their sense of control. And we had seen in the previous definition, the compulsive nature of the disease. Then there is also the characteristic of social impairment. This is about relationship. This is about responsibilities. Somebody is not able to meet their day-to-day responsibilities at work, at school, with families, and at the same time, the relationships start to get strained despite people complaining about their substance use. The root cause of the social problems is basically the substance use, but the person doesn't see that, continues to use nonetheless. Then there is risky use, where someone engages in hazardous behaviors when they are under the influence of substances, or continuing to use substances, even when it is worsening a pre-existing condition, exacerbating conditions, medical or even psychological, such as depression. Here in our country, people love their drink, and when they drink over the weekends, most of them will say that the vehicle knows its way home. So somebody enjoys their drink, how they get home, they don't know. So that can be an indication of substance use disorder. And then we have the pharmacological criteria, where someone now starts to use more than they had initially started to use, and developing dependency in the sense that when they haven't used or they reduce what they have taken because of tolerance, they get to have withdrawal symptoms such as becoming irritable, and some withdrawal symptoms becoming physical, such as having their heart rate being affected, having nausea, vomiting, and such kind of symptoms presenting. So that's on addiction and substance use disorder. Then we have trauma, and we'll be looking at two definitions of trauma. And after that, we get to see, so how do the two of them have similarities? One of the definitions from American Psychological Association is that trauma is an emotional response to something terrible that happens to someone. This can be rape, this can be an accident, this can be a natural disaster such as floods or earthquakes and so on. So with that kind of emotional response, what would happen in the long term is that someone is not able to really predict how they will react to possible triggers of such emotions, continuing to have flashbacks of the events or the series of how the things unfolded, resulting also to strained relationships. We have seen in addiction, there is strain in relationship, and we are seeing also someone that goes through traumatic experiences may also have challenges in relationship with the people around them too. And even at times presenting with physical symptoms, such as headaches. In some times that someone may start having nausea when they see a certain color or having a certain sound that reminds them of the traumatic experiences. The definition that we'll be working with this evening is the definition by the Substance Abuse Medical Health Services Administration. That is, trauma being a response that results from an event. So there must be an event that happens, or a series of them, or some particular circumstances that somebody gets to experience that can either be physically or emotionally harmful or threatening. And in both definitions, we are seeing the commonality of the emotional response to the traumatic experience. And that kind of threat has lasting adverse effects on the person's ability to function physically, socially, emotionally, even their sense of well-being. It is said that trauma changes people. Trauma changes the perception that people have about themselves, the world, and also other people around them. So from this definition, we can combine the event, the experience of that event, and how that event affects them. The interpretation that somebody makes about the event is what is going to determine how they will be affected at the end of the day. You and I can be exposed in a similar situation, but our response becomes differently. I get traumatized, you don't get traumatized. So the event experience and the effect is what we equate to trauma. Borrowing from the DSM-5 of one of the common conditions that we talk about whenever we are mentioning about trauma, that is the PTSD. And you can see, just like in the other definitions, there must be a stressor. There must be an event that occurs for us to say something is traumatized. But it's not always that from this particular DSM-5 that we can say that someone develops PTSD. There must be a time period that lapses for us to say someone is presenting with symptoms of PTSD. Like somebody can go through a loss of a loved one, and it becomes very debilitating that someone is having difficulties in sleeping. Somebody is having intrusive memories about their loved one or the burial process. But that happens just within the first, second, or third weeks of the experience. But 1 month later, after the exposure of the stressor, someone is still experiencing the same symptoms, then we can say that they are developing PTSD, and it's characterized by the stressor itself, somebody avoiding any reminders of stimuli that could be reminding them of the event, having uncontrollable compulsive thoughts, nightmares, flashbacks, and emotional distress. You can see there's some sense of loss of control, just like we are seeing or we had seen in addiction. Then there is changes in how somebody thinks and how they feel, especially associated with the traumatic event. Self-blame. Sometimes the memory shuts. You're asking somebody what happened, and you might think that they are pretending they can't remember, but it's just because the trauma sort of shut bits and pieces of memory of the event. Sometimes becoming very overly negative and having very negative assumptions about self. Like in most cases, if somebody goes through an ordeal such as rape, someone may be blaming themselves, saying that maybe I was scantily dressed, maybe I shouldn't have gone to hang out with that particular person. I brought it to myself. So they get to see the logic that the perpetrator had that intention, and in most cases it had nothing to do with them. Then their emotions also become affected, having negative effects, sadness, and in some other cases, just sense of feeling that they are not worth. Then the last criteria from the DSM of trauma is that there is changes in arousal and reactivity. Someone becomes very hypervigilant. They are scanning through the room to see whether there is any reminder. They are trying to look at whether they can be able to control the situation because they want to know, are they safe or not. Sometimes difficulty in concentrating, having insomnia, and quite irritable. So that forms the foundation of what we'll be looking at. And as we shall be seeing the similarities, the different ways of looking at trauma and addiction forms the foundation for that. I know we know different types of trauma, and as I continue with looking at these different types of trauma, you can also type in the chat what are some of the examples of traumatic events, because for trauma to happen, even as we progress towards looking at the link between that and addiction, there are some traumatic events that we know about. So one of that type of trauma, not a traumatic event, is what we call acute trauma. This is a single incident that stretches somebody's emotional coping abilities, but it doesn't happen again. Then we have chronic trauma. This is like a situation that somebody continuously keeps on experiencing traumatic incidences. Like on one moment you lose a loved one, the next time you get fired from the job, the next time you find yourself in an accident, and so on. So there are lots of things that are stressful, that are frightening, that are even threatening to cause death. Then we have complex trauma. Complex trauma is a type of trauma that is associated mostly when it happens in childhood or during the adolescence years. Mostly physical abuse, sexual abuse, mainly perpetrated by the very people that are supposed to be taking care of this. And out of complex trauma, this becomes quite difficult for people to deal with. And because of also the people that tend to perpetrate it, the persons who go through that, they hardly talk about it. And later on, it may be manifested or presented in different dysfunctionalities. Then we have secondary trauma. I know in the audience, the people that are helpers, we respond to crises and traumatic incidences when they happen, and we get to carry what other people, the people that we help, may have been sharing with us. Yesterday, I was having a conversation with someone, sharing about our experience in one of our unfortunate incidents that happened in our country. We had a terrorist attack, and this person went to support and help. And one of the fears of whether she's fit for counseling was because weeks after offering debriefing and psychological first aid, this person kept on now having vivid memories of what the victims were describing to them. Then we have historical trauma. Historical traumas are those kind of traumas that can be experienced in a mass, maybe cases of war, also cases of maybe like in our country, we constantly have tribal clashes in some parts of the country. So historical trauma can either affect an ethnic group, it can affect a certain people within a certain locality, among others. So people from that particular region will have some different or will have some kind of predispositions and experiences that are tied to the traumatic experience. Then we have intergenerational trauma, not really so much talked about, but this has some history in it, but particularly it doesn't touch on ethnic communities, but it touches on families, how different families have been exposed through their own share of traumatic experiences and how they get to perceive such experiences, which can be passed from one generation to the other. And then last type of trauma is a collective trauma, a bit related with the historical trauma in the sense that it can also affect people from a certain group, or it can be collective. Like right now, globally, as the world, we are dealing with one collective kind of a traumatic experience. Many years later, we'll be talking about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it has changed our lives, how it has changed how we look at the world and such kind of things. If you look at my image right there, sometimes with these different types of trauma, some of them do not get noticed. You can see here some people that may be exposed to chronic trauma. The soldiers, when they go back home, the family members get excited that they are happy they have come without a scratch. But then what they don't know is in this person's mind, it's a ticking time bomb in the name of PTSD. And because people are assuming because of what they can see, you are okay, many people will not know how to talk about such kind of traumatic experiences. And down there is an example of a possible child that could be going through complex traumas. You can see someone that is an adult, quite a giant, and pushing this child into a certain corner, very threatening and very distressing. And the child may never talk about it. Susan, I wonder whether there are examples of traumatic events that have been written in the chat.
All right. I see during the pandemic scenario for most of us, which the person has gone on to explain that people suffer from fear, phobia, others have insomnia, and many other examples that the individual has. That is Professor Kamal, who has given that as a suggestion. Yeah, I think that's the only person who has commented on that.
Thank you very much. And indeed, it just shows that there is a possibility that the whole globe, the whole world has been traumatized. So there are various traumatic events. Some are man-made, others are natural. And it is said the traumas that are caused by man, they have the greatest impact because there are feelings that are involved. Man is quite intentional, but things that are out of the hand of nature, people may be ready just to move on because they didn't have much of a control. But that is caused by man. There is the pain, there is resentment, there are emotions that are connected to it. So then how do these two things get intertwined? What is the connection between trauma and addiction? And here I want to look at some common symptoms between trauma and addiction. And one of the symptoms is cognitive disturbance, a change in how people perceive things, a change in how someone interprets information. With trauma, there comes depersonalization. With trauma, somebody's way of thinking becomes affected, and so is addiction, because we know with addiction, out of the changes that take place in the person's brain, out of their ability to think rationally, they may change the perception that they have about themselves, about the drugs, and many other things. Then we have mood disorders, which are both quite common between trauma and addiction. And because of mood disorders that are prevalent or common to both, what may happen is that we may find somebody becoming dependent on stimulating substances like cocaine. There is and studies have shown that people that have depression, they have a likelihood of using cocaine, and we know cocaine is a stimulant. Then there are difficulties in managing emotions. Trauma activates our survival instinct. trauma activates our flight or fight response. So is addiction, because the substances, they take a pathway where especially within the limbic system, that where we have the amygdala for emotional regulation. So people is like their ability to regulate emotion as hanged as people seek to survive, as people's ability to think rationally has been compromised as the person shifts into a survival gear. Then there is the identity disturbance. The identity disturbance could be presented in inconsistency about the beliefs. One moment somebody believes that it wasn't their fault that that happened. Then the next moment there is extreme blame that they had something to do what happened, and it becomes difficult to forgive themselves. Change in goals, change in things that are important to them. And we also see the same with people that are struggling with substance use disorder. One moment they are really remorseful and they are thinking that it's about they turn around their life, but in the next minute they start asking themselves, what's the point? I'm a failure anyway. Why should I work towards changing? I tried before, I have failed. So the view that they have about themselves becomes distorted. Then chronic interpersonal difficulties because of lost trust. With addiction, there is loss of trust with the loved one. With trauma, because sometimes when the person who have perpetrated the trauma is somebody that is close, there is trust that gets lost there. Then unfulfilled promises, failure to meet obligations. With trauma, someone may withdraw from the world. With addiction, as someone stops to meet their day-to-day responsibilities, it's gonna cause interpersonal difficulties. Then loss of interest in previously enjoyed activities because of the presenting depression that comes with both trauma and addiction. You also find that, and also with addiction, as people start to give priority the substance more than they give to other things like spending time with family, enjoying their job. So they are both shifting and taking people towards a direction that whatever that was giving them enjoyment doesn't give them anymore. Then we have compulsive behaviors. In the definition, we saw addiction being a compulsive behavior. It's like somebody doesn't have a sense of control because of the changes that takes place in their brain that is affecting their prefrontal cortex, or their ability to engage their high decision-making or thinking part of their brain. There is that powerlessness that comes with it. Also with trauma, there is the sense of powerlessness that they couldn't stop the event from happening. And more than anything, even the person struggling with addiction, they are working towards getting a sense of power. That moment that someone is taking substance to overcome the withdrawal symptom, it's a kind of power and being in control that the person is looking for, even if it's in a twisted kind of way. We may see also this sense of powerlessness. For someone that they have gone through sexual assault or rape, they didn't have power over the perpetrator. And what we may see is this person now engaging in sex work, whereby they feel now here they can dictate the terms of what happens. So that kind of sense of powerlessness may move people to engage in some behaviors that will push them to seeking a kind of power and control that continues to remain elusive and put them even in more problem. Then there is the tension and anxiety. Naturally, trauma presents with tension, trauma presents with anxiety, and so is addiction. When people are having withdrawal symptoms, and people are worried of what is going to happen next, and that leads to both people to engaging in tension reduction activities. You hear stories of people with addiction saying that, you know, they have tried so many things, they have lost value in themselves so much that the only way they feel they can escape this is to end their life. Others ending up engaging in self-mutilating behaviors. I've heard stories of people struggling with addiction that they will decide to go and drink so hard and expose themselves to dangers such that they see whether that is more dangerous than the other one. Then both switch people onto survival instinct. I said with trauma, there is the flight or fight response that gets activated. With addiction also, the survival that is there is the survival or not experiencing withdrawal symptoms. So a trauma victim will be surviving to achieve safety and have a sense of control. somebody with addiction will be seeking for survival of ensuring that they have their drug or their substance of choice so that they don't get to experience the discomfort that comes with withdrawal symptoms. So both, again, an activation of similar parts of the brain. Then we have pain. There were some studies that were done of just looking at brain activities, a combination of looking at the comparison of someone's experience of the physical pain and emotional pain. And what was amazing is that there was no way of telling the difference between the two, either physical or emotional pain. And both trauma and addiction exposed people to various types of pain. And what is as a way of coping when people are going through pain, either caused by addiction or trauma, you may find them being dependent on drugs such as alcohol, or you may find them being dependent on drugs such as opioids, because they are working on similar neurotransmitters in the brain that are helping in pain management. So those are some of the common similarities, common symptoms that we may experience between trauma and addiction. But then how do the two of them go hand in hand? What is the cyclic relationship between the two? One, addiction in itself is a traumatic experience, and hearing stories of people in their active substance use, they may tell you the many things that they have gone through, even when they are having withdrawal symptoms, the nightmares, the hallucinations that they get to have, the bad dreams they get to have, and such kind of things. Then the substance use itself is a risk factor for trauma, because the lifestyles that are associated with addiction makes the person more likely to experience trauma. Somebody that is drunk is likely to get involved in an accident. Somebody that is drunk is likely to be beaten by a mob, even without any explanation. And then also the other relationship between the two is that trauma becomes a risk factor for substance use. People will use substances as a way of coping with their underlying painful traumatic experiences, and trauma can be said to one of the underlying causes or feeling actor of addiction. And many people may not be really aware of, and sometimes the trauma goes unspoken because of the stigma that is associated with that, as well as also because of not really knowing the extent of the impact of the trauma. We said it is individually experienced, so the perception of the person will influence the effect, and we shouldn't discount that. So what are some of the evidence that is available that there is a connection between the two? Some studies have shown that rates of witnessing serious injury or death of others and experiencing physical assault are 2 to 3 times higher in people that are using substances than in the general population, with some other studies showing that 2/3 of people seeking treatment for SUD will report one or more of the traumatic event. The question is, are we attuned to be able to listen or to look at these possible traumatic events that people with SUD or addictions may probably be presenting? In another study, between 22 and 43% of people living with SUD have been said to have a lifetime prevalence of substance use disorders, and the rate of veterans, people who have gone to war, was as high as 75. So this tells us that our uniformed forces, people that go to fighting, people that go to war, have a high risk of trauma and possibility of using substance as a way of coping, as we have seen in that cyclic relationship. On to some other statistics, not just on substances, but here on gambling. A certain study that was looking at PTSD symptoms in pathological gambling showed that gambling problems were found that up to 34% had PTSD, those people that were gambling. People with gambling problems who also had PTSD were more likely to experience other anxiety, substance use, depression, and impulsivity, and they may even attempt suicide. Sometimes we just look at behavior at the surface level, and there could be some other underpinnings that we ignore. PTSD, people with PTSD are also more likely to gamble as a way of escaping their problems or their symptoms. With the clients that have gambling problems that I've worked with, one of the likely times that they are likely to gamble is when they are extremely stressed and they don't see how they can get themselves out the stressors. And we saw trauma is when someone is stressed and their ability to cope sort of gets put to test. Some other statistics based on where I want, or closer to where I want to make an emphasis on trauma and addiction, on childhood traumas. And I said earlier, these are possible examples of complex traumas that people will present, and they become quite hard for them to function on the day-to-day life. So in some studies that were looking at childhood traumas and substance use disorders, there was evidence that teens with trauma history, either physical, sexual, were 3 or more times likely to report past or current substance abuse than those that didn't, with more than 70% in another study of adolescents that received treatment for SUD having a history of trauma exposure. 70% is such a high number to ignore. Compared to physical and sexual abuse, childhood emotional abuse and neglect were more predictive of adult depression, where we know there is also co-occurrence of depression and substance use disorder. In another study that looked at substance abuse and childhood traumatic experience, PTSD in civilian urban population, so showed that there is a very strong relationship between emotional abuse and heroin. Earlier on, I talked about pain, emotional pain, and we are seeing these people who are using heroin. Heroin activates or is able to mimic our endorphin receptors, which are for pain management naturally. And you can see why people will be attracted to such a substance that will help in balancing what is not there. Cocaine use was associated with levels of childhood physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, as well as current symptoms of PTSD. Sexual abuse in women was linked to marijuana and cocaine. We know for cocaine because of the depressive symptoms, also with marijuana because it's able to manage the anxiety that may come with that. And the study also showed a very strong association between cocaine dependence and PTSD symptoms, particularly depressive symptoms. Further studies showed a very strong correlation between trauma and addiction among adolescents, with up to 59% of young people with PTSD developing substance use problems, with girls being more affected. And I could go on and on in support of evidence of the correlation between trauma and studies that were done with substance use disorder, but a very strong correlation between childhood traumatic events, health problems, psychological functioning, be 2 times the risk of PTSD, tobacco use, alcohol dependence, injecting drug use, sex work, and other physical health problems, as well as reduced quality of life. Further studies on child maltreatment, where more than half of the women that were seeking treatment for SUD reported at least 1 lifetime trauma. People with childhood maltreatment having the possibility of initiating substance use earlier than those that did not, and women who had experienced childhood trauma having a very shorter period between the onset of their substance use and substance alcohol dependence. The question is, up to this point, how well have we been paying attention to trauma as we work with people with SUD and other types of addiction? Regression a bit still connected to childhood trauma, looking at attachment theory and intergenerational traumas, and attachment being the relationship that we build with our caregivers, that build our ability to regulate our own feelings, express our emotions, feel a sense of worth or love or care, and that ability to explore the world around us and learn how to accurately deal with risk. So, how can this be connected with trauma? When we are looking at intergenerational trauma, the way somebody that was traumatized, could be a parent, how they were coping with their trauma is likely to get passed on to the child. And here I'll probably give a personal example about my mom. She got married into a different tribe far away from where she was coming from. And when she went there, it was a bit difficult for her to get integrated into that population. So it's like she was considered as an outcast, no one to talk to. And one of the ways that she responded to that kind of rejection was to immerse herself in work, being able to bring some types of cash crops that were not grown in the area where she was married into there, having a successful business. So for her, it was work and work and work. But then there are some unfortunate incidences that happened in her life that I lost my siblings, and that became a turning point for her. She didn't have people that she could talk to. And because she had history of just subtle substance use, her alcohol use became quite intense at those various periods when she had lost a couple of my siblings. Fast forward to myself, way back in 2014, when I lost a brother through an accident. It's not that I didn't have all this knowledge about addiction. It's not that I didn't have understanding about the impact and the need to talk to someone. But guess what I did? I found comfort in the similar way what my mom was doing. People say I'm an alcoholic. I think I am. That is one of the ways of getting away from the stressors. But then again, I also had incidences where I had started to abuse substances all by myself. And don't forget, I had this knowledge about addiction. But then again, my mind, you can see how trauma changes people. My mind wasn't thinking, I can give my counselor a call. And I was all surrounded by counselors. And that is what, when you talk about trauma, that it can hack somebody's brain and make it a bit jammy in such a way that the solutions that you're seeing from outside, the person may not be able to see the same. So intergenerational trauma, the question is, how have we adopted unhealthy coping mechanisms from our own parents? Are we even aware of that? Do we engage in healthy ways of dealing with people? Or are we dealing with things? Or are we dealing with the things the same way our parents did and their parents did? And we haven't gotten to a point that we can work and overcome on that. So now let me focus on the adverse childhood experiences, or the ACEs. And these are considered to be those traumatic events that occur between the ages of 0, before somebody turns 18 years. And studies that were done showed that they are linked to chronic health problems, mental illnesses, and substance misuse in adulthood. And they can negatively impact on someone's education as well as job opportunities. And there was a massive study that was done many years ago where there were about 17,000 people that participated in the study. And one conclusive evidence is that those people who experience trauma in their early years often develop survival mechanisms that are less than helpful in adulthood, such as addiction. So what do we mean when you talk about adverse childhood experiences? And this is, in my practice, one of the things that I pick with my clients. And it's amazing how some people have been functioning and not really aware of how this has had an impact into their dysfunctional living. It could be in substance use, it could be also in relationships. So physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal, emotional, physical neglect, living with people that have drug problems, living with people that have mental health problems, where there is domestic violence. We know, during the time of COVID-19 last year, when there were restrictions, where there were lockdowns, and the cases of the most domestic violence spiked, cases of sexual abuse, emotional abuse, because people were just feeling pressured and they were looking for ways of ventilating, and some of them landed on children. Then also living with adults that spend time in prison and having parents that have separated, which is quite becoming a common phenomenon in our country. And when the parents separate, we don't think of what impact this has on the children. And I've worked with teenagers, not that they have developed the ACEs, but their onset of substance use is because of the parent separation, and they feel that it just happened and nobody cared about how that felt for them. So from the ACEs study and what it tells us about addiction, and this is sources from CDC, is that out of that, 64% of adults have faced one adverse childhood experience. From those 10 ACEs that I have just shown you, how many have you faced? Then 40% have faced 2 or more of the adverse childhood experiences. And the more the ACEs, the higher the risk of dysfunctionalities, because ACEs have been shown to affect brain development, increasing the likelihood of cognitive deficits, as well as mental disorders. So from the same studies, it was found that someone that has 4 or more ACEs is 4 times more likely to develop substance use disorders, with a boy being more at risk, probably because in our African societies and Kenyan, people are told to man up, and they tend to be 46 times more likely to become someone that injects drug through intravenous injection. And this has some, from my experience, last year I managed to work with over 30 people that were dependent on opioids. And out of the 30, only 5 were female. But then out of the 20, 18 had more than 4 ACEs. So how is it significant when it comes to treatment? And one of the studies that was done in 2019, especially when it comes to relapse prevention, particularly for people that use opioids, it was shown that there was a very close relationship between ACEs and opioid relapse that shows that ACEs increased the risk of relapse by 17%. That for other person that is struggling with other issues, that as they are navigating their recovery, if they have a traumatic experiences from their childhood, that will increase their probability of developing or going back to substance use. But if people adopted an adoption of trauma-informed treatment, reduce that by 2%. 2% may look like quite a negligible number, but 2% that is involving 3 people being able to maintain their recovery. If one person changes, that's big enough. So why am I telling you about ACEs? Why am I emphasizing on trauma, and particularly, just looking at the need to look at trauma when we look at treatment, so that we screen, assess trauma among the people that are seeking treatment, with the aim of helping them to shift reliance from their survival instinct, because they are surviving to ensure safety, they are surviving to overcome the pain that comes with the withdrawal, and adopt better coping skills, to be more self-regulated, to have their sense of control, to sort of, move them from a point of fighting or flighting, to be able to remain stable and use their cognitive, their high-level thinking, and think, plan, develop problem-solving strategies. Then also to regain personal power through self-control and success. Sometimes we could be doing things out of lack of awareness, but when we become aware, we are able to know why we are doing what we are doing, and we have the opportunity to change something. Then also to shift focus from just looking at it being an individual responsibility to coming up with community solutions. From the ACEs, we have seen that the boy child is more affected. And I must say that I'm really amazed at one of my students. As we talk about coming up with local solutions for local problems, he has come up, and his team, with speak out places for men, where men can go out and speak and talk about what is happening with them. And from his experience and what he has shared with us is that there is a change between the men that have enrolled into the program, how they are dealing with issues, reduction in substance use. We are living in a time that the prevalence of suicides in our country is quite high. And there has seemed to have a change, that you can't do it alone. You can't let the person that has gone through trauma or addiction deal with the issues by themselves. Also to reduce stigma, sometimes a parent who has substance use, who has not been a good parent to their child, may seek help, but what the society sees is that you have failed, you're letting your children down. So when we are able to transcend stigma, for not just substance use, not trauma, but mental illness and the challenges around mental health that we experience, people will feel more safe to talk about what is affecting them and talk more. Then to promote safe, stable, nurturing relationships and environments where children can live, learn, and play. I think the world today does not provide that much, but we can do it where we are. And then lastly, talking about this is that we can adopt trauma-informed care. And there's a lot that can be talked about when you talk of trauma-informed care. And just to pick on some key aspects of trauma-informed care, I want us to remember the ease of what we talk trauma to be, the events, the experiences that someone has, and the effect that it has on the person, that we should not assume just because you were laid off and I was laid off and I didn't have any life-changing experience, it doesn't mean that you can't have. So when working with people that have been affected by trauma, some of the core values of trauma-informed care, we should be able to provide safety. We talked of people being on survival. If they can't feel both physically safe and psychologically safe, they may not begin their journey towards healing. Building trust. Trust is one of the things that get lost when someone goes through trauma, also because of substance use. So we need to seek in promoting trust, keeping promise, confidentiality, giving people choice. If there's anything that people lose when they are traumatized, is that they don't have a sense of control. So giving them options and feeling that they have some sense of control in the treatment plan. Very important, and you need to seek collaboration with that, partnership with them, so that they can feel you're not doing it for them, but you're doing it with them. Then empowering them to build coping skills, to be able to rely on their abilities to control the situation and not always on the survival instincts. And as we do that, there are 4 R's of trauma-informed care. Realize that trauma is a widespread phenomenon. You and I, we may not be talking about it, but we may have been traumatized. Recognize those symptoms of trauma and respond appropriately. And most importantly, resist re-traumatizing the person in the name of helping. So then what can we do for that person that has SUD? Screen and assess for trauma, educate people with SUD about trauma so that they are also able to pick their own possible traumas they may not have talked about. Educate people with SUD about the impact that trauma has, how it changes themselves, how it changes the perception they have about the world, the future, and even the people around them, to see how could the traumatic experiences have impacted and even influenced their substance use. Teach about the trigger and the connection between trauma and how that may be triggering them to go back to using substances, and avoid traumatizing them as well as re-traumatizing them if they may have been traumatized. So as I move on to conclusion, some of the things that we've been talking about is that people that have substance use, they are at high risk of being predisposed to trauma. And people that go through trauma, they are at risk of having substance use disorder. And if we are able to look at the context in which people relapse out of PTSD, then we may be able to do something and have better clinical outcomes if we address the trauma, among other things. Having that increased awareness, therefore, will help us to see that connection between trauma, PTSD, and addiction, for both understanding the mechanism of SUD as well as improving prevention and treatment. And I would like to end this presentation with one of the instrumental people when it comes to talking about trauma and addiction, Gabor Mate, that we need to ask not why the addiction, but why the pain. Thank you very much for your audience. I now want to hand it over to Susan.
All right, awesome. Thank you very much, Kate. Wow, I've learned a lot. I'm not even sure how to summarize. I think I would say that I learned or I was reminded that addiction is complex. Trauma is a response to an event. So let me go to the questions. Thank you very much. Somebody says, thank you very much for the presentation. How do you handle a client who shares their trauma as a therapist and you become traumatized too and the therapy gets blocked. As you think through that question, there's a comment by a prof here who says substance use leads to extrapyramidal syndrome, which is true. Any other comments? I'm not sure whether this is a question, whether fine trauma is due to tremors are due to trauma. I'm not very sure whether you understand that question, but if you can respond to those two. Again, let me say that when you are asked as the questions about kinds of trauma, several were put in. There was rape, there's IPV, intimate partner violence, there's landslides, there's somebody in Uganda who says that the bomb blast is affecting them and several people are anxious. Somebody had their personal experience who says that they had a road traffic accident and they get startled easily. So you can respond to those two questions. Find trauma, is it trauma? And what would you do if you are a therapist?
All right, let me respond to the first question of what one would do if they are a therapist, and then the client shares about their trauma experience, and then the therapist also gets traumatized from that experience. As we're looking at the different types of trauma, we talked about vicarious trauma, out of giving compassion to other people, that we also get to carry what the other person is carrying. And you shouldn't look like there's something wrong with you. It's just that at times you may find, our clients may find us when we are not adequately prepared. So for you to be a better helper, and if it is affecting you in such a way that you may not be able to help the client and you're not remaining objective, it will be good to seek supervision. And if there are some also traumatic experiences of your own that are becoming awakened, I think personal therapy will also be able to help you. And if you can't proceed out of supervision, then the client will be better placed to be referred to somebody that is specialized in trauma. Then there was the other question. I'm not sure whether I got whether it was tremors or traumas. Maybe Susan, you can reread again.
Is fine tremor due to trauma? It isn't very clear to me either, but I'm thinking about extrapyramidal syndrome. So it could be related to that. So probably it's just a confirmation that it is due to trauma, I think so. Do you have any comment, Catherine?
All right. I think I will agree with what you've shared if that is what the person meant, or whether fine trauma is a similarity of that. Yes, as part of those symptoms, it could be, but I will not be able to respond with so much authority because I've not clearly gotten what the question is about. So I hope the person can rewrite the question in a way that we are able to understand.
Okay, so we are at the tail end of the webinar. Thank you everyone for attending. Once again, if you want to put in a comment right away, you can do it. Catherine, I'm seeing a lot of appreciation. Thank you for the brilliant presentation, good presentation. Great presentation, great information. So people have, you have opened our minds, you opened our eyes. Somebody even comments that the boy child has been rescued from being ignored. And anyway, we have learned that there's even a program that is running well in Nairobi for men to speak out. As we proceed, I'd like to mention that this is ISSUP, and you're welcome.
Susan, some clarification. The program is not in Nairobi, but it's in Nakuru.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. All right, so as we proceed, I was saying that this is ISSUP, hosted by ISSUP. So there'll be a link that if you're not an ISSUP member, you're welcome to join us. ISSUP Global is a group of addiction professionals who share information on addiction. And so again, you can also give us suggestions on what you'd want to see here, and probably the team can improve on that. We also have ISSUP ISSUP Kenya, which is a local a chapter for those who are in Kenya. In other countries, there are other chapters in your own countries. You can also check on that so that you can join and belong to the particular groups. As we end, I would like to I want to look whether there's something that may have been posted. Somebody says, truly an eye-opener for us therapists. Very insightful. Kate, you can hear good feedback.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't see additional comments. Most of them are appreciations for your presentation. Great information, great presentation. Thank you very much for the impactful webinar. So thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Again, for those who have attended, you can tell that you've been live because you can see the question and answer portion. The rest you can only share the link to other people, and they'll be able to get this information. Again, we will be offering a certificate which will be coming from ISSUP Global, and it will come in your mail soon. I don't know whether Kate, you'd have closing remarks. And as you close, I think one of the things that I learned is hurting people hurt others, and so it's important for each one of us to seek help. If you realize that you are going through, you experienced the ACEs, or even if you have gone through traumatic experiences, it's important to seek help so that you do not get into addiction. So thank you, Catherine. I don't know whether you have closing remarks as we end.
My closing remark is to say thank you for your audience. And it's a delight to have been on this platform to share with you. I hope because of this webinar, somebody's life is gonna be transformed. Asanteni sana, that means thank you in Kiswahili.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.